I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now. Friends, I am in Nashville, recording this late the night before it airs. Just got back from Washington, D.C., where I had a blast. Bob and I recorded The Road to Now live at the Hamilton Live in D.C. What a good time we had. Thank you to everyone who came out to that show. Had such a great weekend. Bob and I got to hang out again on Saturday before the show with the Avett Brothers played at Wolf Trap. I can't wait to share that episode with you. That audio will be up next week. That'll be a week from the airing of this show, and that will be June 9th. Unless you are one of our supporters on Patreon, if you're there with us, the video, actually the full video of the show, is now available on our Patreon page, patreon.com/theroadtonow. So if you guys are supporting us over there, you don't have to wait. You can not only hear it, you can watch the live and unedited version. For the rest of you guys, it will be up on our feed. An edited down version will be up on our feed next Monday. For today, though, no disappointment, we have a great episode. Our guest is Joseph P. Slaughter. He is assistant professor of history at Wesleyan College and author of a fantastic book called Faith and Markets, Christian Capitalism in the Early American Republic. This is such a great book, and it was amazing because, Bob's interest in Christianity and American history is deep. I am fascinated with the history of American capitalism. This comes together in one major moment where capitalist institutions, which we just take for granted these days, they brought fundamental changes to the way people did things. And of course, a change in the way you live, your lifestyle, all of that challenges people's faith. And I think he makes a really brilliant case that so many of the ways we even think about capitalism today, corporate responsibility, all of this, even for non-Christians, a lot of that comes out of this period and the various responses that we see from social groups and particularly Christian leaders. So I hope you guys enjoy this and have a great week, and we'll be back with a new episode next Monday. Thanks for listening. Take care.
Joseph Slaughter, welcome to The Road to Now.
Thanks so much for having me.
I spend a lot of time in the 19th century. That is my area, American history, 19th century. That is where I feel very comfortable, specifically the first half of the 19th century. And I was thrilled to open your book to kind of dive into the history of our domestic markets and how the young Christian denominations of this country, Methodists, Pietists, German separatists, and Reformed Calvinists, helped to shape the economy that we would grow up in some ways in the 20th century. So I have to ask you, how did you come to this field of study?
Yeah, that's a good question to kick off with. It actually goes back to a historical event that maybe some listeners remember, but if not, back in 2014, there was a big Supreme Court decision, Burwell versus Hobby Lobby. And that got a lot of attention at the time because Hobby Lobby, of course, owned by the conservative Christian Green family, who's also behind the Museum for the Bible in D.C., along with others in this suit, were seeking an exemption from the Affordable Care Act, specifically as related to contraceptive coverage in health plans that they saw as violating their religious commitments. And the decision came out 5-4 for Hobby Lobby and other, as the Supreme Court defined it, closely held for-profit companies. And in a notable dissent, the late Justice Ginsburg made a statement that struck me in particular because I was in graduate school at the time and I was reading for comprehensive exams, this slog where if you're trained to be a U.S. historian, you have to read hundreds of books. And I'm sure, Ben might have his own PTSD from that experience.
My own torture from that hazing.
Yeah, exactly. It's a form of hazing, and especially amongst U.S. historians, I think sometimes particularly acute. And this dissent, Ginsburg wrote that history was not on the side of for-profit companies having religious identities, essentially saying that there's a long history in American tradition of affording certain kind of exemptions and accommodations to nonprofit entities, but that this did not apply for-profit entities, and kind of went on to articulate that their purpose was to make money, and that's sort of it. And I thought that was kind of interesting because in reading for my comprehensive exams, I felt like I was coming across lots of examples from your favorite period, Bob, in the early 19th century, where businesses were created sometimes for explicitly religious purposes and to make profits at the same time. And I was trying to reconcile that with what Justice Ginsburg was writing. And it made me really curious to figure out if I was just, coming across some exceptions, or if there were more of these sorts of things here. Reading about a business that is closed on Sundays in the early 19th century, and that they're formed for that specific purpose, that sounded like Chick-fil-A to me, and I'm sure we've all pulled into Chick-fil-A on a Sunday. Even those that are Christians and are frustrated that they're maintaining sort of their Christian prerogative to be closed on the Christian Sabbath. And so that's what launched me on it, quite frankly. It was sort of curiosity meets current events of the moment. And I left my project convinced that Justice Ginsburg was wrong on that particular point. I'm sure there's lots of points that she was right on in her illustrious legal career, and I felt like that particular dissent and that part of it didn't meet the historical record that I was coming across.
Joe, it's almost like you wanted to find the road to now.
And then we found you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no, I think this gets at something which I think is interesting, and which your book really, really gets into. So your book is about the formation of Christian business enterprise, right? You call them CBEs in the book. And to me, what's fascinating, I think, having spent a lot of time reading the Bible and thinking the book of Acts is the best book by far. It's like, the next act. What do you do? What do you do once the main guy's gone and you got to figure it out for yourself? And it's a radical book. It's a radical book in what it calls on people to do. It really does call on people to give up themselves. And, people in the past have read this book and said it's a socialist book. Obviously there's some, some issues with like what people think that word means. But at the end of the day, it's like, it's about the group and not about the self. But when you talk about Chick-fil-A and other businesses that do this, I honestly think as someone who studies the history of capitalism, I really admire them because it is such an outlier. I get mad at myself when I pull into Chick-fil-A on a Sunday because I'm like, they're doing the thing. Like they're actually, trying to follow it. But as you point out, what it means to be Christian, this is a discussion Bob and I have had, is like, I don't even know that category particularly means much to me anymore because it can mean so many things and it's evoked in so many ways. And you point out that that's not just a modern thing. It goes back to the early formation of capitalism in this country. And the responses are, I think you do a great job of taking people's faith seriously. A lot of people see it, as you point out, as like some type of a mechanism to get what they want. But you take their faith seriously. And nevertheless, these people who are devoted to their faith come up with very different responses to the emergence of the market in the 19th century. So could you talk about that some?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that's the other reason why I wrote this book, is that I was a little frustrated as a graduate student reading a lot of foundational works that really just treated religion as a facade for material concerns. And I think that that's a great observation that Marx made and is probably true more than sometimes those of us who are religious want to admit. But that being said, I felt like the historical record was pretty clear that for many people, they did take their religion seriously in this particular era, as in today, and that there were specific choices that they were making about the ways that they were entering in the marketplace and selling things and building things that were specifically influenced by specific theologies. And, Bob mentioned a few of those at the beginning. And so I really wanted to try to take what was, I think, at best, an abstract sort of exercise, by some historians that I'd seen that were pretty good, where they were talking about, from an intellectual history side of things, how people's theology might inform how they felt about buying, selling, and acting in the marketplace, and try to see if I could link it with actual actions that people took, either in creating businesses or how they ran their businesses or how they tried to shape or change the marketplace. So that was kind of my second kind of project. And yeah, as you said, a lot of it was informed by contemporary ways in which people read the Bible that I was interested in exploring and figuring out how accurate that was. You sort of suggest that people read Acts and see a socialist document. And I would say that a lot of my students, when I teach them and they read the Bible for the very first time, and when we read stuff in Acts, they're shocked because they're coming from communities that are oftentimes not religious and certainly not Christian and have never read the Bible. They don't bring any sort of cultural baggage to reading it, and they are shocked and come to oftentimes your same conclusion that, wow, this is really communalistic. This isn't individualistic at all. This sort of even could be like a form of socialism. And then they struggle to reconcile that with the way they hear a lot of Christians talk about free enterprise or capitalism. We read something written by, say, Liberty University's Standing for Freedom Center about capitalism being the most godly sort of economic system, and they struggle to connect those things. And so I think that was another thing that I learned, and I was hoping that people that read my book would learn, was that Christians haven't always had the same view of capitalism, and that they had potentially visions for it that might not have been realized with our current system, but that they very oftentimes had deep criticisms of that as it was emerging as a citizen. And I learned something from those predecessors of ours in the early 19th century.
All right, so you're talking about Puritan Calvinists, Wesleyan Arminianism, and Pietist Lutheranism. Let's start with the Pietists that you feature. And this is a very communal sect, to the point where they settle their own town, Economy, Pennsylvania. So talk about the Pietist Separatist, who's behind it, and what does this communal business look like?
Sure. For those that are unfamiliar with the term pietism, I mean, this is like one of these obscure academic kind of sounding terms. It's basically, I would say, analogous to the kind of religious person today that might be concerned about purity and compromise. So the kind of person that sets up rules about going and watching R-rated movies, for instance, or how long a hemline needs to be on a dress, or the kind of language you should use, or whether you drink alcohol, or those kind of things. That's the kind of person that we're talking about in the early 19th century. These are German immigrants who want to preserve their particular ways of living as they see as being the best, basically, Christians out there, because they believe by living this really guarded, purified sort of communal existence, they're going to be the people that make it into the next millennium when Christ comes back. And they kind of have these very interesting ideas about the coming, the second coming of Christ.
Okay, first, Joe, I meant to ask you to do this because define our terms, right? Premillennialism, postmillennialism. I think that moving forward in this conversation, it will help everyone listening to kind of, if we just get a primer on premillennialists and postmillennialists.
No, that's a good question. And it sounds like we're just having an academic debate and conversation. But I would argue that understanding those two concepts is central to understanding how Americans have thought about our culture at large the last 200 years. So in the time period we're talking about, most Americans are what we would call postmillennial, in the sense that they believe that Christ is going to come back after 1,000 years when the world becomes more and more Christian, more and more just, more and more equal. And that's why in the early 19th century, so many Protestant Americans were consumed with reform. They're ending slavery, for instance, fixing prostitution, getting rid of poverty, temperance, not having people drink too much alcohol, all these kind of things and then the big missionary movement, sending people all around the world and domestically to convert people. But the pietists that we're talking about are actually not postmillennialists. They are premillennialists. They think the world is unraveling and that Christ is going to come back and make things right and then reign over 1,000-year millennial kingdom. And so that was part of their project and why they were so industrious and why they built these factories and why they hoarded gold and why they tried to make themselves so sufficient economically is because they thought they were going to be the model for not only how you live as a Christian, but how you build economies, how you build wealth, all these things in the new millennium. And so that they needed to be able to be strong enough to survive through the looming sort of unraveling of the world system, but then also to provide the template for this new sort of millennial kingdom that Christ was going to preside over.
Joe, were they America's first doomsday preppers?
In some sense, they really were. And the way their premillennial ideas worked out, they didn't really care about people that they didn't think were going to survive into the next, sort of phase of existence either. They were focused sort of inward on their own community survival. That's a good point.
And what gets me about this is, again, going back to people taking their faith seriously. This community, number one, is incredibly prosperous. Other people look to it as a model. Even non-Christians look to this as this model for like how you could create a good society within the turmoil and the,
Marx and Engels.
Yeah, even Marx and Engels cite this place, which is incredible, right? I mean, all that's sacred turns to dust. They still are like they're holding out, but they take it seriously, and so much so that you talk about the living your daily life. The guy George Rapp starts preaching against marriage and against any type of sexual relations to the point that they can't get new members and their current members aren't having children.
That's a good observation of the manifestation of this and a good, I think, example of how oftentimes these religious commitments can't be explained other ways because they're working towards, in some cases, what we might say the longevity or the persistence or the success of the actual enterprise itself. But they didn't think that was going to be a problem. They didn't think it was going to be a problem back to the millennial things. They thought Christ was going to come back. And so they didn't need to worry about bringing in new members and evangelizing in that sense, the way other Christians did. They didn't need to worry about new babies being born because, Christ was going to be coming back. But yeah, you cite one of the things that did stand out to people as being a little peculiar about them, besides the fact that they all still spoke this Swabian dialect from Württemberg, and the fact they dressed like German peasants, and the fact that they didn't own private property, was that the main leader of this group, George Rapp, had started preaching that one sign of the fall was the growth of sex organs, and that entailed a certain level of defilement, even if it happened within the confines of marriage. And so that the purest, the most pietist of their community would be those that forsook any sex, even if they were married.
All right, give us an overview of Economy, Pennsylvania. Talk about, this is like a mill town, right? It's like a Christian separatist mill town. Describe it for us.
Sure. And people can go visit it today. It's been preserved to an extent as a living historical museum in Western Pennsylvania, just north of Pittsburgh. It's the third of the sites that these so-called Harmonists settled. The first was about 10 miles away, known as Harmony, Pennsylvania. That lasted about 10 years. They were very successful there, but then they uprooted it and they moved to southwestern Indiana. They were there for about 10 years. They sold it to the socialist Robert Owen, and then moved back to Western Pennsylvania again. And the reason why they moved back is because they felt like when they moved out west, they were too disconnected from the markets. And so that's the central thing that you would have seen as a visitor. And they had lots of visitors, as you alluded to, who were journeying to places like Harmony and others that seemed to present the model of what a Republican factory town could look like, because many Americans and even a lot of Western Europeans were consumed with trying to find an alternative to these teeming mill and factory towns like Manchester in England, where you now had these huge masses of urban poverty and squalor and disease. And as the United States was growing and starting to engage in their own manufacturing, there was a hope and a desire to create something different. And so people would come, and the first thing you would notice would be the spire of the church in the middle, and then on either side, flanking it, spewing out smoke from the productive work that was happening on one side in the cotton mill, and on the other side, the wool mill. And they had agents then that carried their wares and their products all throughout the United States and even internationally as well. And everybody worked in some capacity in one of those two mills or in the agriculture that surrounded the town. And then you would see very neatly laid out houses that people lived in to a degree communally. And they would have little small, maybe little garden plots, but even the produce from the garden plots or from the cows that they would milk would kind of go into a communal system. And you would go to a store if you were a member of the community and you check out things that you needed. If you needed a new pair of shoes or if you needed a new shirt, they'd have a store that visitors could shop at. They had a post office. They were always very, very aggressive about trying to secure a post office in each one of their locations because they knew they needed to be connected to the marketplace in that way. And they were also right next to the river so that they could ship things out either through then down to the Ohio and the Mississippi or connect to the marketplace, over land as it might be. But you would see the central point of this town revolving around one, the church spire, the center of it all, and then these two mills on either side.
What were the limits of the communalism, right? Like you mentioned George Rapp and the higher ups, so to speak. What was the I'm trying to think, the hierarchy, the social and economic hierarchies of economy Pennsylvania?
Yeah, well, I think you're getting at how in practicality, none of this works out perfectly. Just like Marx and his buddies end up figuring out too, once Lenin and Stalin and Mao try to institute this thing, that there always becomes some kind of hierarchy. And for sure, that was definitely the case. Rapp, you go there today, his house is enormous, and his adopted son's house is also fairly large right next to it. His trustees, kind of the people that be on maybe the board of the company version of the town, Rapp and Associates, also had really nice brick houses that were definitely nicer than the rank and file houses that you saw there. So for sure, there was a hierarchy. And it's kind of interesting, if you asked, as I did when I went on a tour there several years ago, the tour guides kind of play it off a little bit as, well, you have to understand that compared to the monarchy and the hierarchy that these people came from, this is still pretty, egalitarian, in comparison. But I will say that visitors also remarked on that aspect of, sort of a divide and a hierarchy as well.
Tour guides, you get a lot of that, especially, Sarah Vowell writes about this great in Assassination Vacation, but it's the thing you observe when you go there. It's like any place dedicated largely to a person. After you work there for a while, you tell the story so many times that you're just like really wrapped up in it, and we don't want to like knock the person. But it's worth knocking. Though I want to say it was impressive when they founded this, that he really was like to each gave what they had. Right. And, he points when he raises the money for this town, because he has to buy the land, which he comes over without the money he needs, which is interesting. But I guess, hey, you believe the Lord's going to help. And it turns out they got the money. But if you were wealthy, you bought many acres of this plot. You paid for many acres of this plot. You didn't buy it, but you paid for it. If you were poor, you were allowed to come in without paying for anything. So it's sincere there. By the end of it, though, you're right. He's doing business under his own name as opposed to the community. Do we in fact see what Marx was pointing out there, which is that in spite of one's sincerities, the market itself, leaves nothing sacred.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a good question, and you're sort of alluding to how he starts engaging in like speculation and and
Investment capitalism.
investment capitalism. Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's true, and I think again, I think part of that is none of them. I mean, they were all very convinced Christ was coming back pretty quickly. Didn't have a huge foresight of exactly all the things that they were going to have to navigate as the market in the United States became more sophisticated and expanded as well, and further enmeshed them in that growth. And yeah, that's a really good observation for sure.
When we think about the 1830s, late 1830s, we think of the economic crisis that befalls the nation around 1836, 1837, 1838, 1839. And we think about the bank war, and we think about the importance of gold and how, the nation was not very liquid, and that kind of led to some of the problems we had. A name popped up in your text that I'm very familiar with, Nicholas Biddle. So talk about the hoarding of gold that took place in Economy, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and it's not even just the hoarding of gold, but Biddle being connected to the Second Bank of the United States, and then the larger story of how Rapp and his adopted son, who's really his chief financial officer, Frederick, they're like connected with the banking world in general. And so when the banking crisis happens, and they know, for instance, that when they lived in there's two different big sort of crises that they lived through. One around 1819, and then the second one that you're talking about. Banks are failing left and right in this era. People are establishing so-called wildcat banks that are sketchy and don't have the money to back up all the loans and debts that they're incurring.
Robin Hood, anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And when, for instance, the sort of state bank of Indiana at the time is getting ready to go under, they have the inside knowledge to try to make sure that their money is safeguarded and they get it out and don't lose everything they have. And then meanwhile, they're floating gold in barrels hidden all the way out from the East Coast to try to continue to stockpile up. And they have Nicholas Biddle and others invested, in this scheme. And it's a fascinating example of how there's this duality in the society. They want to maintain their purity from a Christian sense, this kind of fundamentalist desire to be ritually pure. But then on the other side of it, in terms of the capitalist side, they are so enmeshed in the economy in all these different ways, from very established to innovative to secure to sort of insecure and sort of almost like we'd say sketchy kind of ways. I think it's in some ways a really good commentary of some of that duality that you see, in the United States today amongst a lot of Christian communities, where they're living this dual existence of wanting to maintain these sort of purity boundaries on one hand, and then on the other hand, they're just so enmeshed in the larger, sort of consumerist society in ways that totally, jeopardize that whole project.
It's like Righteous Gemstones, early 19th century. My analogies are ridiculous today. I'm sorry. They don't deserve that. So, but this just represents one of these three major strands that you talk about. This is the separation, right? And it's a brilliant story. I mean, I think there's so much to it. The first thing I thought about as I was reading this was my own research into Americans who moved to the Soviet Union in the 1920s to start these communes, because it's this very similar pulse. Like a new world is emerging. We have to be there for it. It's opportunity. It allows us to have, for those guys, it's not, religious freedom, but it's ideological freedom to build the world they see coming. There's so much in that. But the other ones, I think the ones that probably will sound more familiar to folks today are the other two strategies, and these certainly leave a huge impact on capitalism, or I would say not necessarily capitalism, but the way businesses work today. And these strategies are reform and engagement. So could you talk about these other two forms and how they emerge, and then how we see them today?
You're right. So the communal side doesn't leave as lasting impact, even though they're just one of a whole slew of, in that era, and like you said, in other eras, Americans who have that sort of alternate vision that they offer. And I think it's important, especially for Christians today, to know that there are these other earnest, seemingly following the Bible practitioners who come to a very different sort of conclusion about the marketplace and private property and those things. But to your point, the desire to keep most of what they like about the market, but just kind of reform it a little bit into something that seems more Christian as they kind of define it, is the one sort of vision of the reformist. And then for those that are trying to do a little bit more engaging and not as concerned about the reforming piece, I call those sort of the virtue capitalist, or the Christian virtue capitalist. And, an example of the former are people that don't want to do any business with people that have anything to do with slavery, for instance, or don't want to do business with people that sell alcohol, or don't want to do business with people that work on Sundays. And so trying to create alternate economic systems that don't have anything to do with that. And we see examples of that today with, say, Christian investment on one hand, or liberal progressive investment on the other, with ESG, or in Christian circles, investing in things that are going to try to provide an alternate marketplace for you to try to reform the system, and then also maintain sort of your sort of ethics and at the same time. And that's a little bit different from the virtue people who are maybe trying to make redeemed products to sell or run their business in certain kind of virtuous ways, but are making less of an effort to kind of reshape the market and provide an alternate economic system completely.
All right, so describe your example. This is very much in line with the research that I do, and particularly about the free produce movement. The idea of purchasing produce and agriculture that were not made by enslaved hands. And that was a big movement in the 1830s and 1840s. So, but give us your example that you feature in your book of this reformed Calvinist of movement, and talk about maybe like a little bit about, describe Charles Finney and kind of the world that this kind of grew out of.
Right. I mean, if there was one era in U.S. history I could transport back to, I would love to go back to the early 19th century, because it just seems like this just wild time. And part of that is this crazy episode of revivalism that is happening in places like Yale, but also happening out in, Kentucky. And then it's happening in, these new upstart communities alongside the Erie Canal. And so the one that I'm looking at specifically is that last example. And you have a series of people, Charles Finney is kind of the most noted version of that, who's coming out of what we normally think of as, sort of, and kind of joke about Presbyterians being the frozen chosen, or these other sort of little trite phrases we have for, kind of the nature of what that sort of religious experience is like. But Finney is not like that at all. And he's actually famous for these new mechanisms of conducting church and revivalism, most prominently the anxious bench, where you have some poor person or two sitting up front and everybody can see them, and they're probably maybe close to converting. They might be an important person in the community. And Finney from his pulpit is just going to like zero in on them like the whole service, and really focus in on them. And he had a whole slew of these kind of sort of new measures, as he called them. And he was really incredibly successful. And people have written a lot about the success he has, especially kind of in the upstate New York area, even moves on to New York City, a little bit less successful there, but he leaves a huge mark on this region, because when people converted, because back to our discussion about millennialism, because they were post-millennial, then they decided, hey, we're going to go get involved in reform associations, because this was, classic kind of evangelicalism that says you should be transformed, and you should be transformed so dramatically that it affects you in all aspects of your life and it drives you to action. And so maybe one form of action is to tell other people about Jesus, but if you see, people drunk all over the place, and you think in your mindset, contingent on Christ coming back is us fixing these kind of things, then not only do we need to convert people, but we also need to fix the things around us. It's one of the big ironies today, where you have this huge divide between liberal Protestants who talk a lot about social justice, and on the other hand, you have conservative evangelicals who only want to focus on evangelism, don't want to have anything to do with the other. Back in this era, there wasn't that divide between the two. They saw them as being symbiotic with one another. And so I argue here that what we see are examples of people not only joining these reform associations, but actually starting businesses too, to try to do this kind of reform in the society. And the one that specifically I look at is a stagecoach line that is set up to try to be one example of a whole slew of steamboats, stagecoach lines, and other forms of transportation in that era that would only work 6 days a week and not 7 days a week, which was becoming more common. And the reason why it was becoming more common is because suddenly, because of things like the Erie Canal, better road systems, steamboat lines, people in Rochester, New York, even as far as Buffalo, could see themselves as being connected to the big marketplace centers of New York City, Boston, Philadelphia. And they were nervous about falling behind other people in those marketplaces as they become more enmeshed and connected with one another. So there's this huge temptation to work 7 days a week. And a big piece of that becomes the transportation of the 7 day week service that becomes pretty routine by that point in the 1820s and 30s.
It really becomes this, it's this era that most people don't think about. I talk about this. I try to do a lecture on this in my classes just to get people into the mindset. The collision between an agricultural society and an industrial society is tremendous. You can't work 7 days. I mean, you work 7 days a week for much of the year when you're a farmer, but not to the rhythm of you work to the rhythm of nature. And once you have things like the Erie Canal, once you have manufacturing, suddenly you work to the pace of the machine and the clock comes into your life. And to me, it's not surprising when these new ways of coming about, and the idea of you invest so much in something, you've got to get as much as you can out of it. And no longer do you control the tools are owned by someone else. It makes perfect sense that this world would be one in which people were looking for new ways to express their faith. But what you still see here, especially with this example of Bissell, is using one's economic leverage to impose one's vision on the world. And that's a thread we can talk about later on, I think comes into the present. So could you talk a little more about how he did that, about how he worked to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're referring to Josiah Bissell, this founder of this pioneer stagecoach line, which is this alternative 6-day service that could take you from Albany to Buffalo. And you're absolutely right, because one of the things that I wanted to describe about this period was this collision. And this collision that typically, when it talks about religion, which plays prominently in this story in general, as it's being told by American historians, has been informed more about this being a way that these new capitalists wanted to discipline the labor force, or in that sort of way. And I think, there's important points that they're making about that. But I saw this more as almost from a sort of a culture war standpoint of wanting to enforce a larger community standard of how you exchange, when you travel, when you don't, on everybody around them. And that was the pushback that they got that Bissell in particular, who is very, very vocal in op-eds that he's writing. He has a newspaper he controls to try to put out sort of his cultural view on how you do business, how you live your life as part of a larger community, and uses the business in extension to fight these larger kind of cultural battles with the people in his sort of area of the world. But he's part of a larger network, which is why this is not just a local story. There are these big national conventions every year that he's a part of that are trying to extend this throughout the rest of the country, where in their mind, people would only drink a certain amount. They would only work a certain amount of time. They would perhaps, abstain from certain kind of, like you were talking about, the free produce movement, things made by enslaved labor. There are a whole series of ways in which they saw this being sort of an essential attempt to reconfigure American life into something that they thought was going to lead actually to the doom and destruction of the country, because it was this story of decline, and specifically spiritual decline, and that God was going to judge the whole country for this, in kind of an echo of how you hear some of the rhetoric about culture war today, and that looming judgment of God is the result if people don't turn from X, Y, and Z.
Something's really I actually just thought of now in this conversation even is that Ben said that this conflict between agriculture and manufacturing, essentially something like that you just said, Ben. I'm sorry if I didn't quote it correctly, but
Yeah, that's basically the gist of it.
all the examples in your book take place in the North. You talk about that and the differences between the way these faith movements broke out across the North. And there were, I guess, some. Give us an example of something in the South that compares either religiously or economically.
Yeah, I think you did you write the review of my book for the Journal of the Early Republic? I think that was like their complaint. It's like, hey, this is only a story about the North.
This
what about
is not
the South?
no. Look,
Yeah.
Joe. When I wrote that, I was drunk. I'm just kidding. I didn't write that. No, look.
That makes me feel better.
A, I didn't read that. B, I don't say this. This is not a criticism. This is not a criticism. It's an observation because,
Right.
look, this time period, what was the biggest issue besides the bank politically? It was the tariff. And it was a tariff that protected Northern manufacturing and that the South felt like was not fair to them, to their agricultural pursuits. Manufacturing never took hold in South Carolina. There were attempts, but it never took hold. And then the labor of the South, we know what that was, versus the labor of the North. So I'm just curious, and even the religious movements, like besides separatism, Calvinism, we'll talk about Methodism shortly. You had Robert Owen. You talked about Robert Owen and these utopian movements, right? These utopian, am I thinking of Francis Wright? Is that another name that I should be thinking of? But none of this that I've come across happened in the South. Nothing like it. It's like two different worlds.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is the difference between how the market is transforming in the two regions. That, this to the same point of, say, these communal societies, you look at these map and U.S. textbooks of the explosion of all these communal societies, the vast majority of them are all also in the North, throughout sort of this antebellum period. And this fixation on trying to set up Republican factory towns is really largely a Northern story. So places like Waltham, Massachusetts, or Paterson, New Jersey, or Lowell, Massachusetts. I mean, there's so many, or the Samuel Slater and his mill, system. These are very much, and these are things that, to be honest, a large part of the Southern culture disdains and sees as antithetical to being Christian in some ways. And so I would venture to say, and then there's been a lot written also about, and so I don't want to overstate the case, but there's been a lot written about plantations and functioning as businesses and functioning within a capitalism that maybe it's a little bit different from what's unfolding in the North. But I would venture to say if you pushed a plantation owner he would probably say that he's running a Christian enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
And that might make us all pretty uncomfortable to say that, but I think that they would not see a division between sort of the Christian world they perceive informing their, as they would describe it, paternalistic love of their enslaved labor, and contrast that against the so-called Christians in the North who were abusing their wage laborers, and would
Yes.
say that actually the real Christian economic system that we're running is down here in the South with this. And, and you have people like Robert Louis Dabney and others who then are kind of arguing this after the Civil War. So I think that's how I would sort of maybe answer that a little bit, that there's a reason why I probably didn't pull examples quite as much from the South, because I think it's kind of representing some different capitalist visions, and maybe somebody else can write that book as a sort of a second volume to mine to kind of help paint out the broader landscape.
Well, I think
across two places.
I think Matthew Karp did. I think this vast Southern Empire, if you're familiar with that work, I think that fills in to some extent or explains. And again, this is not a criticism of your work at all, at all. It just, to me, again, reading this time period, as much, I haven't read this, I'm not the world gold medal champion of reading this time period by any respect, but I do find myself gravitating to it again and again and again. And it's something that I think about often, is where all this progress was in the North, all the growth of technology and all the experimentation and societal experimentation and economic experimentation, it seems to have been happening in the North, and slavery equaled stagnation. And you see that when the Civil War, in the fighting of the Civil War, and in the actual, implementation of the Civil War on both the North and the South, what one region, it was sectional war, as Ken Burns now says. Ken Burns now says that the Revolutionary War was the Civil War, and the Civil War was a sectional war. And so the section of the North was just better developed to conduct that war than the section of the South.
Yeah, but I think, one of the things your book points out, Joe, is that to get one's vision of the world out there, it takes power. And there's just a dispersion of power in the North like there isn't in the South. And I mean, if you talk about the evolution of capitalism, this was recently somebody pitched to me the idea that I would teach a thematic U.S. history course on the history of capitalism, like as like basically for undergrad, like for first year students, one of the required gen eds. And I said, yeah, no, I'm never going to do that, because the problem of it is, I think, to take seriously and to really study the history of capitalism in the United States, you have to read some of the great early critiques of capitalism. And some of the best ones honestly come from plantation owners, because they are so interested in defending their system that they can see what's going on in the North, and they have an incentive to do that. And I said, right. I can't have a student that's halfway paying attention in a class like this, because one week we're going to be reading the writings of Southern slave owners to see their critique, and then a couple weeks later we're going to be reading probably something by Marx, and it just means that students who are halfway checked in, half of them will want to fire me the first couple of weeks, and the other half of them, you got to take it seriously and understand that I'm not advocating for the positions, is what I'm saying, right. but they're there. But getting into this now, do you have this third wave? Because I want to make sure that we get all these in, and I think this is where we see. I think when people say, these Christians, and they don't have nuance with it. And a lot of times they see this last one, which is the engagement part. And the idea of engagement, that one can fully engage the culture, fully engage the marketplace, embrace it, praise laissez-faire as this holy system. And I guess to make it simple, one can be both pastor and sell merch.
Yeah, it was the people that I look at are the Harper brothers, who people are probably familiar. Their name is still, with HarperCollins today. it outlasts them just being an enterprise founded by four brothers in New York City in the early 19th century, and then becomes the kind of really maybe one of the most powerful publishing firms in the world by the mid 19th century. And everybody knew that it was informed by their Methodism. They grew up, like many Methodists in the end of the 1700s, as relatively modest in their means. But then, like many Methodists by the mid 19th century, were materially doing really well. And it's fun because it's a story of the evolution of Methodism, on one hand, from a small little sect that was tainted by the fact that it's founded by people that were loyalists to Britain. And then by the mid 19th century is the largest denomination in the country. And the Methodism of the Harpers in particular was kind of a urban Methodism. And so it fit well with four people who are trying to build a company. But in doing so, they had some of the natural things you would expect, like not working on Sundays, but also using Christian editors to edit out parts of books that they thought were maybe less redeemable for its customers to read about. And then also to only publish certain kinds of things, not publish stuff that was too dark and esoteric, like Edgar Allan Poe. And to also not publish certain kind of unredeemable genres like fiction, which was becoming increasingly popular in that time period, and to only publish, more upstanding things like biography and travel narratives and, religious texts and scientific texts and things of that nature. And so to try to what they thought was vital in an era where increasingly large numbers of people have the right to vote and to participate in the economy in meaningful ways, that people need to be virtuous, educated, trustworthy kind of citizens. And so they created these school libraries, these personal libraries you could have, and tried to make things relatively affordable for what was a new and expanding middle class clientele. And not just produce Bibles or other religious tracts, but had a pretty broad notion of what was moral and spiritually informative and redeemable for people to buy.
The Harper brothers, they kind of had a list of rules that they conducted their business and lived by. Talk about some of those rules and how that helped. Like you said, this is an example. This is I guess the only example that is still in existence today. So how did this business, rooted in these rules of moral conduct, how did that help them to navigate being around for hundreds of years, 200 years?
Yeah, no, these rules that you're discussing, one primarily guided all of their publishing decisions. That was only to publish things that they saw as being morally redeemable, or that would be good to publish, a good quote unquote book or product, magazine, pamphlet, whatever it might be. But then more specifically, in terms of the way they ran, to try to be enterprising, but do it with sort of, quote, utmost caution, or to try to have the highest sort of quality product, but at the lowest possible cost, to hire and then retain the best possible talent, to try to pay employees at rates that equal to their abilities, and then to treat them as, quote, sort of one man should treat another. So they have a whole set of principles that didn't not only just guide the kind of stuff they wanted to produce, but just the way they went about their producing. They certainly had their detractors. You can find examples, and I talk about a few of the authors who didn't feel like they treated them as judiciously as they professed to do so. And so there's room to, criticize them and doubt their execution. But I think that people that knew them attested to at least their commitment to try and live according to what they thought were sort of Methodist principles for living, a very redeemed, and they would use the term kind of sanctified life, becoming more and more like Jesus. And you see this in them in their spiritual lives for sure, because we have great records from their church attendance and their leadership of Methodist classes where they would teach in kind of small group type settings that are probably familiar to some 21st century Christians today. And so there you see that on one side, and you see their desire to sort of enact it in their business. And like I said, there were certainly probably areas in which they were open to be criticized on it, but I think their earnestness is something that I was pretty convinced of.
We only have limited time now to talk about all the ways that these visions of the world manifest themselves today. But the one I think will be most surprising to people is you mentioned that despite all of the faith here, that it manifests itself in some ways that are not at all really associated with faith. And you point out that the vision of the world, this principle that one can amass wealth to create the world one wants to see, actually is represented in Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And I agree. I mean, Musk is weird. I've been pointing out recently that the guy has like 15 kids or something like that and 5 wives. And it's very bizarre. The guy who wants to send us to Mars is living like it's Utah in the 1840s. But nevertheless, this vision of the world, could you talk more about this and how you can trace it back to this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, for instance, I mean, one of my little soapboxes is that Christians or conservative people that are annoyed with things like DEI or ESG investing or other forms of so-called values that are being expressed by corporations or business leaders, like really only have these prior eras of Christians to blame, because they've pioneered the whole idea that a business should do more than just make profit, and that it should express values or virtues, oftentimes those of the proprietor or the entrepreneur that started it. And you have, I think, a whole slew of examples of that today in the marketplace, from something like Thrive Cosmetics to Beyond Meat to even, I would argue, like you said, something like SpaceX or Blue Origin, because if you read the stuff that they write about saving humanity in a very messianic way, by establishing colonies or extraterrestrial existence for human beings, it's completely a millennialist kind of view that comes from these other sorts of eras of Christian folk. And so I think that, Christians very much, I think, made a case strongly for business enterprises that express values and the virtues of their owners, and that's got a long tradition in our history. And that now, we shouldn't be surprised that we see, some maybe different manifestations of that, particularly as the religious landscape of the country has become more pluralistic or even maybe post-Christian in some contexts. And so the Silicon Valley people, have their effective altruism or these other kind of religious ideals that they claim sometimes are guiding, their vision of capitalism and business. And it's just sort of I think a natural evolution and reflection of a society that's become sort of more diverse in those ways, to go beyond just Christian business enterprises to, spiritual business enterprises or, some other kind of religious business enterprises in some sense. And obviously there's a spectrum that we can say some of these are maybe more or less so than others. But I just got into, just the last thing I'll say about it is I just got done teaching this unit to first year students that I call, or this class that I call Jesus Chicken, about the intersection of religion and business. If listeners aren't familiar, there were some progressives that called Chick-fil-A derisively Jesus Chicken, and then some Christians that sort of reappropriated it as a badge of honor. And we do a unit on sort of beyond Christian business enterprises, and specifically stores like Erewhon and the original Whole Foods that are guided by sort of Zen Buddhist principles and are trying to reimagine the capitalist system in a reformist kind of way. And, I think students very easily see how they come right out of the same sort of bucket as these other Christian businesses that they've looked at, like John Wanamaker and his department store, or R.G. Letourneau and his earth moving company, or such. So yeah, I would totally sort of, agree with that.
I think somebody said recently to me, and it's kind of one of the things that I've taught to my students as well, is you study history not, to study change over time. But you also study history because when you get into it, it allows you to imagine all the ways the future could have gone at any moment. That this is not a destination, and that when one feels like, oh, that's just the way it is, you go, well, there's a reason for that, but it doesn't have to be that. And it struck me as I was reading your book that this is what moved you. You really wanted to allow people to imagine different variations of what this place could be. Was I right about that?
Oh, absolutely. And I find that to be one of the most hopeful things about studying history is that it doesn't lock you into a paradigm of, if you have a historical understanding, it doesn't lock you in a paradigm of despair over maybe something you don't like about the current moment. Because very oftentimes the past points us towards other possibilities, maybe other eras where things were actually different and people like you or me thought differently about things. And they either thought differently about things in ways that maybe give me hope that we could resuscitate some of those ideas in different forms, or maybe hope that, hey, those ideas changed over time into something that I think is actually a better thing. And that gives me hope that, that could be, our future in some capacity too.
The book is Faith in Markets, Christian Capitalism in the Early American Republic. Joseph P. Slaughter, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today.
Thanks. It was a lot of fun. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to The Road to Now. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell the world by giving us 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts or 5 stars on Spotify. Or spread the word directly. Just text a friend maybe, or share a link on social media. Anything helps and we appreciate it. And if you've got a friend who hasn't gotten into podcasts yet, let them know they can hear us every weekend on SiriusXM's POTUS Channel 124. Now is the time when we say our special thanks to our supporters on Patreon and give a shout out to our Washingtonians. That list is Tanya Marsh, Mary Hawking, Tim and Caitlin Wells, Fig White, Matt Williams, Team Martin, Ann Williams and Frank Edwards, Nate Farrer, Jennifer and Magnolia, Chris and Teresa Adams, Joy Avery, Edward Carlson, and Aaron and Derek Garrison. Thanks to all you guys for supporting us. If you want to support our work and maybe get on that list, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/theroadtonow. You'll get extended versions of select conversations, extra episodes, bonus materials, and more. That's all available at patreon.com/theroadtonow. For more on the show, visit our website, theroadtonow.com, where you can easily search our back catalog and quickly find links to content. Why is it so good? 7 Ages Design. That's who made it. If you're looking for a website, go check them out. The Road to Now is hosted and produced by Bob Crawford and me, Ben Sawyer. Our associate producer is Gary Fletcher. This episode was edited by Gary Fletcher, and our theme music, like pretty much always, was by Paul DeFiglia. For Bob Crawford, this is Ben Sawyer. Thank you for listening. Take care.